The book of Ecclesiastes starts by raising the question of what can be made of human life. What good is work? What good is wisdom? What good is wealth and pleasure? And the teacher, the speaker, the writer here, goes through all these different explorations, and it turns out that nothing is really good for human life. Nothing profits human life. Wisdom can lead to, in the end, to death, and the wise person has nothing to show for it. The rich person has to leave all of their goods and belongings and wealth to somebody else. And who knows, Ecclesiastes asks, if the person who comes after them is a wise man or a fool. So that's the opening of the book. Everything is meaningless, everything is a chasing after wind, and there's nothing new under the sun. The second part of the book of Ecclesiastes then turns to a bigger question. So what kind of universe do we live in? Is it governed by laws and principles? Is this God who's up there watching over this in any kind of sensible way? Or are we just all subject to fate? If I can't establish anything through my own achievements, if I can't make the world definitively better because it's just a cycle of one thing after another, what kind of universe is this? The second part of the book of Ecclesiastes pushes back on the book of Proverbs, which told us that life was ordered, that the wise would flourish, that the good and faithful would be blessed, that the wicked would be punished and would suffer for their folly and for their insolence. So the question then becomes now in Ecclesiastes, if we see that that doesn't actually always play out, if the good don't always benefit and the bad don't always suffer, what kind of universe do we live in? Ecclesiastes 3 begins with a famous poem. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. Just for fun, you can go back and listen to a famous song from a 1960s American rock group called The Byrds. They wrote a song called Turn, Turn, Turn that simply takes the lyrics from this poem in Ecclesiastes and with a few minor editorial changes puts them all to song. This poem moves through the ordinary experiences that you and I go through. There's a time for birth and there's a time for death. There's a time for mourning and there's a time for rejoicing. There's a time to speak and there's a time to remain silent. The poem has often been read as an affirmation that every event has a proper place in God's providence. And that reading captures something important. The passage carries attention to it. Human beings, you and I, live within a time while remaining unable to govern all of our conditions and circumstances. Every event has an appointed moment, but you and I don't get to possess or control the entire pattern. The author of Ecclesiastes, the teacher, immediately asks us, what did we gain from all of our labor? The question that the opening chapters has opened up now returns. Human beings act within a world whose times they cannot control. And that's really at the crux of Ecclesiastes. We possess enough intelligence to recognize that life has a certain order, that the world seems like it has some kind of foundation and sense and logic to it. But we lack a full perspective to understand the whole of that order. We experience existence from within our particular moment and time. And the past now is only available to us through memory, and sometimes through secondhand memory of other people who have written it down. And the future is nothing better than a hope or an anxiety. Neither can be possessed in the way that we possess the present moment. Ecclesiastes 3:11 expresses this mystery. It says, God has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, he has put a sense of the past and a future in our minds. Yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. The traditional translation speaks of God placing eternity in the human heart, though the Hebrew expression can be a little bit debated. The larger idea here is clear. Human beings possess an awareness that reaches beyond the immediate moment, but we remain unable to comprehend the whole work of God. Michael V. Fox argues that Ecclesiastes repeatedly holds together the conviction that God governs the world with the recognition that we cannot understand his governance. The teacher's difficulty comes precisely from the coexistence of those two realities. This creates a problem for wisdom. The wisdom tradition assumes that human beings can learn and perceive the order of creation and benefit from it. Wisdom is, after all, the ability to coalesce our experiences of cause and effect to more accurately predict future causes and effects. Proverbs repeatedly urges us to acquire wisdom because wisdom enables us to live skillfully in this world that God made. Ecclesiastes accepts the value of wisdom while asking us, how far can wisdom really take us? The teacher, therefore, speaks with a certain humility, which is kind of unusual in ancient literature. Often the records are of kings bragging about themselves. But this teacher has examined life and has found that his mind reaches a boundary. Ecclesiastes 8:17 says, I saw all the work of God, that no one can find out the work that is done under the sun. However much people may toil in seeking, they will not find it out. Even though those who are wise claim to know, they cannot find it out. Wisdom cannot remove mystery. The teacher then considers injustice, and the question becomes more pressing. In Ecclesiastes 4, he looks upon the tears of the oppressed and sees that they have no one to comfort them. Power rests with those who cause suffering. It's a brief observation, but the implications are huge. The world that you and I live in contains suffering, and we can't easily explain it or understand it. If you go to the famous Reformed theologian John Calvin, Calvin talks about the fact that suffering exists within God's world because God has a secret plan for it. If we could see everything from God's perspective, all of it would make sense. We would have no more questions. But we are always limited by our finite experience. Thus, we have to trust that the wisdom of an infinite and supernatural God is better than our wisdom, and that God will always know things that we don't. So the one who goes through suffering does best to endure with the anticipation that God will have reasons and that God is always on our side because he loves us. Ecclesiastes returns to this problem in chapter 8. The teacher observes that judgment against wrongdoing is often delayed. When punishment doesn't come quickly, wrongdoers get more proud of themselves and more bold. They do worse things. The moral structure of society itself seems unstable because justice doesn't always arrive at the moment that we need it. The teacher here is remarkably restrained. He doesn't attempt to explain every instance of suffering. He observes the world and carefully admits that we cannot always interpret what we see. That also places Ecclesiastes in a conversation with Job, because Job's friends assume that suffering can be explained. It's because Job must have sinned. Job must have done something wrong. We see the same thing in the life of Jesus, when he and his disciples come across a man who was born blind. And their question for Jesus is, who sinned? Was it this man or his parents who sinned that resulted in his blindness? And Job shows us that cannot be explained. That's not the account of why Job suffers. Jesus answers, not that this man sinned nor that his parents did, but that this happened so God's glory could be shown through him. And then Jesus heals his blindness. Job's experience destroys the confidence of the people who think that the world's order is predictable. Ecclesiastes then approaches that same problem with a broader perspective and arrives at the same conclusion. Human beings do not possess sufficient perspective to understand divine providence. Job asks why a specific man suffers. Ecclesiastes asks, what kind of world is this where suffering is inexplicable? Both books eventually lead us to the limits of human understanding, and both stand as a challenge to the book of Proverbs. The teacher's observations also create tension with more confident forms of wisdom. Ecclesiastes recognizes the consequences of wisdom don't always appear in the form that human beings expect and want and deserve. The question then becomes not just whether or not wisdom has value, because the teacher seems to preserve the idea that it does, but it raises the question of whether or not wisdom can give you and I mastery over the conditions of our existence. And Ecclesiastes lands on the answer that it cannot. The teacher is therefore challenging a deep human desire. You and I want a world to be sufficiently intelligible that we can make ourselves secure in it. You and I are afraid of an unstable world, and so we learn cause and effect in order to protect ourselves. And wisdom helps us to coalesce our experiences of cause and effect, and thus better predict the future. But what good is that if this world won't follow laws? Jesus speaks to the same human desire in the Sermon on the Mount. He asks whether anxiety can add a single hour to a person's life. And anxiety is itself concern about the future. Are we sufficiently in control to avoid suffering, or is it out of our hands? And Jesus says, you're not going to make your life any better by worrying about it. Jesus does not tell his hearers that the future is irrelevant. He just says it's out of our hands. It's in God's hands. We even see this when Jesus faces crucifixion, and he stands in front of Pontius Pilate and the high priest, and they say to him things like, don't you know I could have you crucified if I wanted to? And Jesus says, you would not have that power if my Father had not given it to you. He seems to trust that the order of the world is in God's hands, even when it seems that the world is out of order. Jesus also tells the parable of the rich fool in Luke chapter 12. A man has accumulated great wealth and gotten rich, so he decides he's going to build a bigger barn, store it all up, and then retire and go to the beach. And he's confronted with the reality that that very night he's going to die. That very night his life will be demanded of him. What good was all that? Storing up for pleasurable retirement and losing the present moment. That sounds like a gospel version of Ecclesiastes. That's why Ecclesiastes says again and again, I saw it was better to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The point of Jesus' parable is not that possessions are entirely bad, but that our assumption that material abundance can provide security, which should only come from God. Ecclesiastes makes exactly the same observation. When we look at Jesus' own life, we see something similar. Ecclesiastes says that human beings can't overcome death through wisdom or labor or riches or achievement. The Christian story places Jesus in that same condition of morality. He doesn't escape human limitation by acquiring political power or accumulating wealth. He enters fully into the vulnerability of human life. The crucifixion then appears as the deepest possible encounter with the problem of Ecclesiastes. The perfectly righteous man still died horribly after being tortured. It seems like the collapse of all the disciples' hopes. The person in whom they had entrusted the future was now executed. The resurrection, of course, changes the meaning of the crucifixion. The Christian life therefore sees death and resurrection of Jesus as an event whose full meaning was hidden from people as they first experienced it. John Calvin would like this kind of thinking. Ecclesiastes does not predict the crucifixion in a direct literary sense, and the teacher is not describing it. The book must first be allowed to speak in its own historical context and settings. But it's natural for Christian readers to recognize the important theological resonance between Ecclesiastes and the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Ecclesiastes says that human understanding is limited, and the gospel shows that God acts in ways that don't make sense and that often surprise us with better plans than we would have made for ourselves. This is why at one point Jesus confronts the apostle Peter, who says he would not let Jesus be crucified. And Jesus replies to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," because Peter is trying to do something that he thinks is best, but it's not what God has in mind. The cross also offers a Christian perspective on the problem of providence. The disciples couldn't see what God was doing, but that should not lead every Christian to explain every tragedy by claiming that they already know its hidden purpose. Ecclesiastes gives us reason for caution. We may trust God without pretending to understand everything that's going on. That's one of the best benefits of Ecclesiastes and this vantage point on divine providence. It leaves us with a perspective of intellectual humility. And intellectual humility is necessary for wisdom, and it's such a rare find because cultures today exalt wealth and glory and accomplishment. And the person with intellectual humility admits to things that they don't know and can't do. And God actually works better through humility than accomplishment. He doesn't need us to be celebrities in order to work through us and to speak to us. It's actually through the humility of surrendering to Him that His wisdom shines the most clear. Human beings often want faith to provide a complete explanation for reality, and we want to know why every event occurs, but Scripture doesn't give us those kinds of answers. And Ecclesiastes reminds us that the faithful response may be in simply acknowledging humbly that we don't know. Now, in the end, that doesn't lead Ecclesiastes to pure skepticism. He continues to talk about God. He continues to affirm the importance of wisdom. Humility arises from the conviction that God is greater than us. So the book, in the end, gives us a vision of a particular kind of wisdom. Wisdom means learning how to live responsibly within a reality we can't understand. Do your best. Do justice. Do rightly. Work hard. Enjoy life. A person can trust God without having all the explanations and still live well. Jesus repeatedly calls people to faithful action in the present while leaving the final future in the hands of God. His parables often place human beings in a world where the outcome remains hidden. Seeds grow while the farmer waits. The kingdom develops in ways that cannot be immediately observed. And you and I are given responsibilities for the present day. We can't necessarily see all the results, but we are to go about the work of God anyway. And the disciples then become an example of that pattern. They follow Jesus. Jesus tells them that they will suffer for the sake of His name, and many of them become martyrs. But their deaths were not a waste, and they certainly weren't punishment. The martyrdom of the first followers of Jesus, defending the story that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead, becomes a powerful testimony to the truth of the gospel narratives. If they had simply fabricated the stories, it wouldn't be worth dying for. If they had made them up for some kind of personal gain, at the end of the day, they should have surrendered it and said, "No, I made that up, and I'd rather live than die." But many of them went to their deaths, defending the story that Jesus had died and risen from the dead. This is in great contrast to the great cults of history, the great false religions of history. Cult leaders, false religious leaders, are almost always in pursuit of money, sex, and power. If you look 600 years after Jesus at the life of Muhammad, Muhammad lived for money, sex, and power. In his younger years, he was a thief and a caravan raider who murdered people and robbed from them. In the Quran, he dictates that unlike other men, he, the prophet, is allowed to have as many wives as he wants. And then he and his followers went around conquering by the sword and forcing people into their tribal religion. Now today you see people required to bow down and listen to someone sing over their heads that there's only one source of God's word, and it's this guy who chased money, sex, and power 1,400 years ago. Or again, if you look at the modern day and look at the story of Joseph Smith, who founded Mormonism, Joseph Smith was in pursuit of money, sex, and power, without question. He slept with many of his friends' wives and encouraged polygamy. He, in his younger years, was described as a treasure hunter who was always looking for a buck. And at the end of his life, when he died in a prison riot, he was running for president of the United States because he saw it as a pathway to more money and power. He lived a sleazy life, and that is a marker of cult leaders. The disciples of Jesus lived radically differently. Jesus himself lived radically differently. They didn't go trying to secure wealth and power in this world. They let go of it to trust God Because the algorithms of this world don't follow a meaningful pattern, and we can't control the outcome of our lives. So trusting God and surrendering to Him is always the best way to go. That, at least, is the teachings of Jesus and those who immediately followed after him. The teacher's reflections on time therefore lead to another kind of humility. We inhabit the present, but we can't possess the whole story of history. We can make choices, but those don't always have determined consequences. We cannot eliminate mystery through our decision making. The recognition of these limits challenges how we should live. They should make us a little less confident in our own ability to control things. And that's how Ecclesiastes begins to move towards a final answer for life. The inability to comprehend the whole of God's work does not make the present worthless. It creates the conditions necessary for receiving the present moment as a gift. The teacher has spent much of the book showing that human beings cannot secure the future. The next question is whether or not they can learn to enjoy the portion of this life that's been given to them. The teacher will return to mortality, but he will also speak about joy. He'll talk about eating and drinking, and he'll talk about work and companionship. He'll talk about the passing of youth and the approach of old age, and how to live wisely in each moment of the day. Human beings can't possess the whole of life. We just receive the moment in which we've been placed. And that is the wisdom that Ecclesiastes means to impress upon us. I like Ecclesiastes because it is a book of existentialism. It talks about the purpose and meaning and value of human life. And it should give us all pause to ask the question, am I really living purposefully? Or am I chasing someone else's dreams? Am I just doing what my parents wanted? Or what the government requires? Or what would look good to my peers? Or am I actually living for the kind of satisfaction that is true happiness? A kind of happiness that is always tied to our Creator. That's the question that Ecclesiastes leaves us with, and that's the question that I'll leave you with today. God bless your studies.